just out of curiosity, does anyone here not know who Aleister Crowley is? Never heard of Aleister? Okay. Anyone else? Anyone know his work really well, so well that you wouldn't admit it in public? All right. Okay, so Aleister Crowley was an English writer. And during his life, he achieved some fame as a poet and a novelist, and he was also a very accomplished mountaineer. However, he's best remembered as the most famous mystic, magician, and occultist of the 20th century. And the tabloid newspapers of his day certainly contributed to his long-lasting fame when they branded him the wickedest man in the world. Now, Crowley's unsavory reputation was largely due to his libertine sexuality and his drug use, both of which he was quite open about. And Crowley used a wide variety of drugs, but his use of cannabis and peyote are of particular historical interest. So I'm going to say more about that later. But first I want to say something about Crowley and then explain what is meant by magic, because Crowley has a very particular understanding of magic, and it was very influential in 20th century occultism and esotericism and magical traditions. So, Crowley's family were members of the exclusive sect of the Plymouth Brethren, who were a small but extremely fundamentalist Christian group. As a child, his only reading material was the King James Version of the Bible, which he became fluent in and could recite from memory. If you gave him a chapter and verse, he could say what it was. His father was a preacher, but died when Crowley was 11 years old. And then Crowley was raised by his mother and her family, who he consistently depicted throughout his life as like religious bigots, almost to the point of insanity. In adolescence, he was privately educated by tutors, and in 1895 he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, to study the moral sciences. And he spent most of his time at Cambridge reading all the classics of poetry and philosophy and literature that were forbidden to him when he was a youth. Is that too loud, or? Okay. He also began publishing his own poetry and exploring his sexuality. And around this time, he began to study occultism and the esoteric traditions. And one of the ideas he encountered in the occultist literature is the notion of a hidden school of mystical knowledge that instructs earnest seekers of spiritual truth, the so-called Invisible College, which is a school in which all who thirst for knowledge are instructed by the spirit of wisdom itself. And Crowley became determined to discover the entrance to this school, and in 1898 he found his way into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is the most famous secret society of the Victorian era. The Golden Dawn basically instructed its members in the theory and practice of ceremonial magic, so I kind of describe it as like Hogwarts for posh Victorians. And Crowley only spent about 2 years in the Golden Dawn before it erupted into schism over the integrity of its leadership and the authenticity of its founding documents. But his time at the Order made a huge impact on him. He continued to study magic independently for a while, but then temporarily abandoned it. And he traveled to Ceylon in India and learned to practice yoga at a time when basically nobody in the West was traveling to these places and practicing yoga. The Theosophical Society were talking about yoga, but they weren't doing it. So he got married, and him and his wife Rose went on an extended honeymoon. And it was on his honeymoon, Crowley said, that the only event of his life which has made it worth living took place. So according to Crowley, while on honeymoon in Cairo, their honeymoon was interrupted when his wife Rose began to receive messages from the Egyptian god Horus. And while Crowley was initially skeptical, a chain of synchronicities led him to take Rose's claims seriously. So he followed the commands of Horus, and that included a magical ritual to invoke Horus. And this culminated in Crowley being instructed to go into a room in their apartment from noon until 1 p.m. on 3 consecutive days, where he had to write down exactly what he heard. And Crowley said that a mysterious entity called Aiwas dictated a book, which he transcribed. His text is called the Book of the Law, and it announces the law of Thelema. Thelema is an ancient Greek word for will, and it also has connotations of divine will. The core principles of Thelema are: every man and every woman is a star, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, love is the law, love under will, and there is no law beyond do what thou wilt. So Crowley interpreted this to mean that each human is intrinsically divine, and each of us has a divine mandate to discover our own personal path through life, and we have the absolute right to pursue it. For Crowley, the Book of the Law marked a new stage in the spiritual evolution of humanity and a new aeon for mankind. Whereas most previous religions had asserted that human life was essentially sorrowful, Thelema affirms the divine perfection of the physical universe and proclaims pure joy as the essence of existence. So Crowley was initially reluctant to accept the revelation of the Book of the Law, but he increasingly identified with its message and eventually fully embraced the role of the prophet that he considered himself to be, the great beast 666. He wrote extensively about magic for the rest of his life. He designed his own tarot deck as a compendium of his magical knowledge, and he was the leader of two magical societies which still exist today, the AA and OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis. So I'm going to say now what magic is in Crowley's system, because you can't really talk about Crowley without kind of understanding his basic definitions of these concepts. So what is magic? Well, in Book 4, which is Crowley's main philosophical work on magic, he begins with an analysis of religion, asking what do the religious geniuses of mankind have in common? Figures like the Buddha and Christ and Muhammad. And he says that although they share no common dogma or doctrine, there is a common factor in the stories of their lives, which is an omission. He says, we hear nothing of Christ between the ages of 12 and 30. Muhammad disappeared into a cave. Buddha left his palace and went for a long while into the desert. Each of them, perfectly silent up to the time of the disappearance, came back and immediately began to preach a new law. In all of these cases, a relatively unspectacular individual disappears and then reappears, sufficiently inspired to initiate a new religious movement. Crowley says there's no known analogy of this in the world of nature. You can't even imagine like a super dog who comes along and transforms the world of dogs. But in human society, this happens actually regularly and consistently. So what is it that happens to these religious geniuses? Well, Crowley said they had a transformative experience during their absence. Sometimes these are called supernatural or spiritual or a union with God. But for Crowley, it was not supernatural. It was just a natural development of the human brain. And these transcendent experiences provide access to the secret source of energy responsible for creative genius. And the experiences themselves are characterized by transformations of consciousness that are drastically different to normal consciousness. So by normal consciousness, Crowley means a dualistic consciousness, where there's a strong distinction between the subject and object of consciousness. In other words, between the knower and the thing known. During a transformative religious experience, that division between subject and object dissolves, and subject and object are united. And this divine union results in a drastically different form of consciousness. Now, according to Crowley, there are actually practical techniques for attaining these transformations of consciousness, and they ought to be studied scientifically so that we may better understand these experiences and benefit from them. He summed up his approach in the motto of the Equinox, which was his journal of experimental occultism. The method of science, the aim of religion. In other words, he wanted to marry scientific methodologies and experiments to religious practices. So the two techniques that Crowley specifically was interested in about transforming consciousness are yoga and magic. And by yoga, Crowley means meditation. He actually uses the words yoga, mysticism, and meditation interchangeably. He doesn't mean just holding the downward dog pose for a long time. He means yogic meditation, where you have devoted aspiration to the divine and a single-pointed concentration upon divine union. And success in this leads to a transformation of consciousness, in which the boundaries between the ego and the non-ego are dissolved. Now, the difficulty with meditation is it's very tough to constrain the mind to single-pointed concentration. And Crowley heavily emphasizes that success is determined by creating psychological and physiological conditions that are favorable to transcending normal consciousness. It's not dependent upon divine grace or moral purity. The various limbs of yoga are techniques that aid concentration. So asana, the practice of holding the body still in a particular posture for an extended period of time, this has the physiological effect of silencing the mind's awareness of the body. Makes it easier to concentrate. Pranayama, the practice of focused, controlled breathing, has the physiological effect of regulating the body's natural processes so they present no distraction to the mind. Yama and Niyama, the practices of regulating lifestyle and behavior, have the psychological effect of eliminating environmental and emotional distractions to meditation. So there's no supernatural or moral reasons for these techniques, they're just purely practical, psychological and physiological. But the difficulty with meditation is the second you sit down and try to concentrate, your mind immediately does everything except concentrate. So Crowley recommended using ceremonial magic to develop the will in such a way that you can control the mind. Ceremonial magic is the Western parallel to Eastern yoga. And like yogic practices, magical practices develop the mind and focus the will. In meditation, the mind is constrained to a single point until normal consciousness is transcended. In magic, the mind is ritualistically exalted by ceremonial instruments, words, symbols, and gestures until normal consciousness is transcended. So meditation is an introverted method of transforming consciousness, and magic is its extroverted analog. Crowley says of magic, there's a single main definition of the object of all magical ritual. It is the uniting of the microcosm with the macrocosm, or in the language of mysticism, union with God. So the supreme goal of magic is identical to the supreme goal of meditation, namely its divine union. Crowley described this divine union in magical terms as the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel, which is a concept he encountered in a 14th century German magical text called the Book of the Sacred Magick of Aleister the Mage. Crowley depicts the Holy Guardian Angel as the personal god of the magician, an infallible divine guardian who lovingly guides the magician through their spiritual evolution. And the magician must invoke and achieve contact with the angel in order to be able to practice magic without fear of self-deception. Crowley says, by development of willpower, by rigorous self-control, by solitude, meditation, and prayer, a man may be granted the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel. This being attained, he may safely confide himself to that guardianship. This attainment is the most sublime privilege of man. Now, Crowley claimed he had achieved the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, and it was actually Aiwass, the entity who had dictated the book of the law. Now, I'm actually going to skip these, but I can come back to them afterwards if anyone has questions about it. So ceremonial magic is this ritualistic practice of transforming consciousness. But Crowley also uses the word magic to mean something else. There's several different meanings. Another one is a science in the early stages of its development. Magic, Crowley says, investigates the laws of nature with the idea of making use of them. He says it's only different from profane science by always keeping ahead of it. Magic is a science in the tentative stage. So in other words, magic also refers to any natural phenomenon that science has yet to adequately describe and predict. So before it was understood why magnetic objects behaved the way they did, magnetism was magic in this sense. But now that magnetism is more easily described and more easily predicted, it's just considered another part of natural science. Crowley also says that magic is the science of understanding oneself and one's conditions and the art of applying that understanding in action. It's basically the science of understanding your own individual nature and the art of applying that understanding so that you fulfill your nature. And probably the most famous definition of magic from Crowley is magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So every intentional act is a magical act. From ceremonially invoking a god, to issuing military commands, to flushing the toilet, because all of these acts are attempts to cause some kind of change in conformity with your intention. So this is the basic idea of Crowley's philosophy of magic. It's a metaphysics of willed change, which applies to everything not only ceremonial magic or rituals. Ceremonial magic is just exemplifies this philosophy in a very concrete way. So what is magic? Crowley uses the word in various ways. It is ritual practices that focus the mind, develop the will, and lead to transformative experiences. It's also a name for an experimental proto-science, any science in an early stage of development. More philosophically, it's a philosophy of self-understanding and a metaphysics of will changed. And actually, these aren't different definitions, they're actually kind of like points on a spectrum. So, let's have a look at the role of drugs in Crowley's magic. So, Crowley's experimentation with drugs and magic started in 1898, when he began receiving private lessons in magical practice from Allan Bennett, who was a senior member of the Golden Dawn. Bennett was an analytical chemist and a very well-respected magician in the order, almost feared by some of the people. But he suffered from severe asthma, and he possessed an extensive range of chemicals that he used to treat his own condition. So he would take opium for about a month until his tolerance was too strong for it to have an effect, and then he'd inject morphine for about a month until his tolerance built up. And then he would switch to cocaine, which he would take until he started to see things. And then he would switch to chloroform until his opium tolerance had worn off, and he'd go back and start to cycle again with opium. So when they first met, Bennett was broke and nearly homeless, and Crowley was heir to a small fortune, basically. So Crowley offered to host Bennett in his apartment in exchange for lessons in magic. So Bennett moved in with Crowley and brought along his medicine cabinet, and the two young men spent months experimenting, combining every chemical substance and magical practice that they could, searching for the key to unlock the mysteries of magic. And Crowley later credited Bennett with bestowing upon him the right art of magic. Crowley said they even searched for clues about this secret key in occult fiction. And they discovered in occult fiction one tiny seed fact, one constant story in all of these occultist stories. And it was a story of a seeker after the hidden wisdom who meets an adept and obtains a mysterious drug or potion which opens the gate of the other world. And Crowley identified this as the elixir vitae, or the elixir of life of the alchemists, which transforms the base metal, which Crowley equates here with the normal perception of life, to silver, which he calls the poetic conception. In other words, a drug that induces mystical consciousness. Now, interestingly, Crowley actually wrote his own occult fiction, including a short story called The Drug, which was published anonymously in 1909. And it tells the story of a man who discovers that his friend is a secret alchemist who has created a strange liqueur that causes extremely intense visions and a kind of mystical death and rebirth experience. Now, the drug is not named in the text, it's just called the drug that giveth strange vision. But the experience bears all the hallmarks of a classic psychedelic experience, and it was written around the time that Crowley was experimenting with a commercial fluid extract of peyote. So it's almost certainly a description of a peyote experience, and one of the earliest published. And in 1909, very few people were even aware of the existence of peyote, and almost nothing was understood about its remarkable effects. But Crowley was secretly writing about it, and he was leaving hints of its mystical potential in his own occult fiction. In 1906 and 1907, Crowley experimented combining his meditation practice with cannabis. He said that he had heard that many lesser yogis in India had used cannabis while meditating to more easily attain mystical states of consciousness, and he wanted to test the theory. And his diaries from the time show regular experiments of increasing dosages for over a year. In 1908, he wrote an article summarizing his findings called The Psychology of Hashish. And the text is a really fascinating analysis of the effects of cannabis and of mystical forms of consciousness. Crowley concluded that cannabis is a useful aid to meditation, primarily in the early stages of practice, because it gives the meditator a taste of mystical consciousness. And this assures them that there's results worth working for. But he claimed that he had no use for hashish himself, apart from demonstrating this to his students. However, it's clear from an analysis of his diaries from 1906 and 1907 that his most significant yoga results at the time occurred during his hashish experiments, typically when he had taken the biggest doses. It's also clear from his later diaries that he continued to use hash for over a decade in his magical ceremonies. So I believe when he's saying this lesser yogis and this claim that he has no use for hashish, this is tongue-in-cheek. I think it's actually to throw off people who would assume that there's something fundamentally profane about drugs. Crowley also used drugs for astral projection, which is the practice of willfully dissociating consciousness from the physical body and transferring it to an astral double that perceives a different universe called the astral plane, which is not accessible to the normal senses. In the Equinox, Crowley speculated that astral projection could be greatly assisted by the use of drugs, if only one knew the right drug. Now, Crowley doesn't say what drugs he would use. However, coincidentally, the same issue of the Equinox contains excerpts from the Hashish Eater by Ludlow, and also has a poem by Crowley that mentions peyote by name, which is one of the very few times that he does it. And if those hints were too subtle for his readers, he even included an advertisement for his own personal pharmacist from whom he bought his own cannabis and peyote extracts. So again, Crowley was leaking these hints. They were there if you knew what you were looking for. Crowley also used drugs for rituals of invocation, and he published 2 rituals called Liber Nu and Liber Had, which require an elixir and wine and strange drugs for the performance. Now, the elixir is almost certainly a reference to the fluid extract of peyote, because the same term was used in an essay called Energized Enthusiasm, which describes 3 traditional methods of arousing ceremonial ecstasy. The methods of Dionysus, Aphrodite, and Apollo, which Crowley also describes as wine, woman, and song, or as we would say in a more contemporary and gender-neutral way, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, this essay contains a summary of the experiments that Crowley conducted in private with his magical students, where he combined music and poetry and peyote to try and create a kind of group ceremonial ecstasy. And this idea later evolved into the Rites of Eleusis, which was a series of semi-public group rituals performed by Crowley and his students. And one performance actually involved the audience of invited guests being given a cocktail of peyote and fruit juices. And one audience member said, "We were thrilled to our very bones." I'm not surprised. Now, this phrase, wine and strange drugs, comes from the Book of the Law. There's a verse in chapter 2 of the Book of the Law that says, "I am the snake that giveth knowledge and delight and bright glory, and stir the hearts of men with drunkenness. To worship me, take wine and strange drugs, whereof I will tell my prophet, and be drunk thereof." Now, Crowley published a comment to this verse. Hadith, which is the name of the deity who is speaking in this chapter of the Book of the Law, now identifies himself with the Kundalini, the central magical force in man. This privilege of using wine and strange drugs has been confirmed. The drugs were indeed revealed. So Crowley understood Hadith, who is the deity speaking this particular chapter of the Book of the Law, with Kundalini, which is the magical force in mankind. And he considered the use of wine and strange drugs a legitimate technique of spiritual attainment, which makes sense because he put such an emphasis on making physiological conditions that are favorable to producing mystical experiences. He also says that the drugs were revealed, which suggests he thought peyote was a revelation. And this also makes sense, because he obviously recognized how powerful it was. He was one of the only people in the world who knew it existed. And he was the only person basically using it outside of Mexico. So, of course, this was like a revelation. I mean, imagine. Crowley was also convinced that he had contacted and communicated with Praeterhuman entities, entities that were both more than human and other than human. And in magical operations of this sort, Crowley would try to communicate with the entity via the mediumship of a clairvoyant, who was usually, but not always, a female and his lover at the time. Typically, they would both exalt their consciousnesses through an intense combination of magic, drugs, and ritualistic sex performed to the point of physical exhaustion. The medium would then try to scry or explore the visionary state and report to Crowley the messages that the entities conveyed. And Crowley would test to see if the entities displayed a telepathic knowledge of his own personal magical language. And apparently they did convince him, because he later said, "My observation of the universe convinces me that there are beings of intelligence and power of a far higher quality than anything we can conceive of as human. That they are not necessarily based on the cerebral and nervous structures that we know, and that the one and only chance for mankind to advance as a whole is for individuals to make contact with these beings." Now, the fact that Crowley used peyote in these magical ceremonies to contact entities is fascinating, given how prevalent the phenomenon of entity contact is in modern psychedelia. So, conclusion. For Crowley, the goal of yoga and magic is divine union, whether it's described in mystical terms as the union of subject and object, or in magical terms as the invocation of the holy guardian angel. The goal is identical. It's to access the secret source of energy responsible for genius, to elevate and enlighten in consciousness, to achieve an understanding of our nature and to fulfill that nature. And Crowley definitely believed that some drugs could assist this process. Crowley's experiments combining drugs like cannabis and peyote with meditative and magical practices were crucial to the theory of yoga and magic that he developed. From his early experiments with Allan Bennett to his later solo experiments, Crowley continually revised his understanding of the role of drugs for religion and science. Although his experiments took place over a century ago, he clearly had no doubt that drugs could play an important role generating religious ecstasy, providing important spiritual insights, inducing beneficial personal transformations, and giving access to realms of novel information and non-human intelligences. Thank you for your attention.